If you're confused whether you should be buying the Canon R8, the LUMIX S5 Mark II, or the Sony ZV-E1, well, I don't blame you, because all three cameras offer fantabulous value for money. Considering I've been using Canon cameras for the last 3 years, and that I bought the LUMIX S5 Mark II about 2 months ago, and I've also shot with Sony cameras, I'm going to attempt to make your buying decision a little bit easier. We'll go over a few key differences between these cameras, and I'll also give you my personal opinion about each camera. The Canon R8 has a 24 megapixel full frame CMOS sensor, identical to the sensor on the R6 Mark II. The LUMIX S5 Mark II has a 24 megapixel full frame BSI sensor, and the Sony ZV-E1 has a 12 megapixel full frame CMOS sensor, identical to the sensor in the $6,000 FX6. Now I'm not gonna lie, I'm not exactly sure what CMOS stands for. Maybe it's cameras most often sold. Either way, all three cameras have amazing sensors which produce amazing images, but the S5 Mark II is the only one with the backside illuminated sensor. See, at least I know what BSI stands for. And generally speaking, backside illuminated sensors have better sensitivity to light than CMOS sensors, and this gives you better dynamic range. But keep in mind that the camera's processor also plays a big role. That being said, the point for sensor performance goes to the S5 Mark II because it's 24 megapixels and BSI. Now let's talk about video resolutions and frame rates. The Canon R8 gives you 4K footage downsampled from 6K, and 6K minus 4K is 2K, which is totally irrelevant. But what is relevant is that the R8 gives you 4K 60 without a crop. The S5 Mark II can't shoot 4K 60 except with the Super 35 crop, but it can shoot 6K up to 30 frames per second without a crop. The Sony ZV-E1 can not only do 4K 60 without a crop, but word on the street is that a firmware update is coming out which will give it 4K 120. And if Sony is able to pull that off without the camera giving you third-degree burns, then Sony wins the high frame rate debate. Another area where Sony can't be touched, no pun intended, is low light and high ISO performance. When shooting in log, the ZV-E1 has a dual gain ISO of 640 and 12,800, whereas the S5 Mark II has a dual gain ISO of 640 and 4,000. The R8 also has a dual gain ISO at 800 and 3200. What this means is that all three cameras have very good low light performance, but the ZV-E1 can be repurposed as a military-grade night vision device in case of an all-out zombie apocalypse. But I have to get serious for a second, because we're about to talk about some serious features. Sony just went full retard and added some new autofocus capabilities that don't even exist in their flagship cameras. You can register a face, and if there's numerous people in the frame, it'll keep the focus only on that registered face. You can also tell it to do the opposite, and the camera will stop down the aperture to get everyone's face in focus when you're in a group. You also have a product showcase mode, where the camera will switch focus when you hold up a product and switch back to your face when you put it down. The R8 also has a product mode as well as a face only mode, which is very useful. The face only mode on the R8 stops the camera from switching focus to the background when you leave the frame. The AF on the S5 Mark II is also amazing, and in my experience, it's been super reliable. I've been using it the whole time for this video, but unfortunately, the S5 Mark II doesn't have any of those advanced autofocus features the Sony and the Canon have. If Panasonic adds these features with the firmware update, that'll be solid. But for now, the AF award goes to Sony. And speaking of firmware updates, Canon isn't known to give its cameras new features through updates. As a matter of fact, I wouldn't be surprised at all if they start removing features through updates. And unfortunately, it looks like Sony is starting to go down a similar path. The ZV-E1 has features that could and should be given to the A7S III and FX3, but most likely never will be. Now on the contrary, from what I've seen so far, LUMIX is pretty good about giving life to their older cameras through firmware updates. So the win for future proofing goes to the S5 Mark II. Now let's talk about image stabilization. The Canon doesn't have any IBIS at all, but has very good digital stabilization. And if you're familiar with the Canon Wobblegate scandal, then you know that it's a good thing that Canon left out its IBIS. The Sony ZV-E1 has IBIS, but it doesn't really do much. But their new enhanced digital I.S. can give you gimbal-like footage even while walking, but it comes at the cost of a large crop. The S5 Mark II, on the other hand, has IBIS, and it's the best IBIS I've personally ever used in any camera. So the S5 Mark II most definitely gets the point for stabilization. Now let's not forget that these cameras are hybrid cameras and can also take pretty nice stills. The R8 and the S5 Mark II both have an EVF and a fully articulating LCD screen, whereas the ZV-E1 lacks an EVF. Also, the ZV-E1's low 12 megapixel sensor is great for video, but not so much for photos. The 24 megapixel megapixel sensor on the R8 and S5 Mark II are much better for photography. The Canon and the LUMIX are pretty similar in their photo capabilities, but the S5 Mark II has an edge because it has IBIS, which is going to help out a lot when taking photos. So the point for photography goes to the S5 Mark II. Moving along to dynamic range, the ZV-E1 is rated at 15 stops. The R8 looks to be about 12 usable stops in my estimation, and the S5 Mark II is rated at 14 stops, and having used the camera for some time, it looks to be pretty accurate in its 14 stop claim. Now you also have to remember that you're not just buying a camera, you're essentially buying into a camera ecosystem, so the lens lineup is crucial. Without doubt, the Sony E-mount has the largest lineup of lenses, both expensive Sony lenses and affordable third-party lenses. The LUMIX comes in ahead of the Canon because it also has high-quality affordable third-party lenses, whereas Canon banned third-party manufacturers, so the point in lens selection goes to Sony, with LUMIX in second place. By now, you might be thinking that the ZV-E1 is looking like the clear winner, but I'm about to go into rapid fire mode and mention a whole bunch of things about the S5 Mark II that clearly put it in the lead ahead of the R8 and the Sony ZV-E1. The S5 Mark II has 2 card slots, so no need to worry about card failures. The S5 Mark II has a built-in fan, so no need to worry about the camera spontaneously combusting. The S5 Mark II has a full-size HDMI port, which is a pretty big deal. The S5 Mark II has an anamorphic mode, open gate recording, cinema features like shutter angle, waveforms, and synchro scan. It can shoot ProRes RAW over HDMI. It has 4-channel audio and a bunch of other cinema features. So here's how I would summarize it. The S5 Mark II is a better photography and filmmaking camera. This makes it the best value for money. You can use it for content creation or professional commercial use, and you don't have to worry about overheating at all. The R8 is $500 cheaper than the S5 Mark II, so you can save some money, but you'll have to buy 2 extra batteries because it has the worst battery performance of all 3 cameras. If you only plan on using it inside the studio, then the battery doesn't matter because you can just plug the camera into the wall socket. If that's your main use case and you already have other Canon cameras and lenses, then the R8 would make a lot of sense. Now the Sony, being the most expensive of all 3 cameras, is the least attractive to me. If you already own Sony cameras and lenses and you're looking for a content creation camera that you're not going to be using for long takes, then the ZV-E1 has its place. But I can't see anyone using this as their main camera for professional use.